Today we're going to be talking about graphing practice mixed rationals. So first I'm going to give you guys the steps on how to graph. So it says the steps for irrational functions. So number one, we're going to locate the vertical asymptote. So remember, in order to locate the vertical asymptote, we're going to find where the denominator is equal to 0. So we set our denominator equal to 0 and then we solve. Step number 2 says we're going to determine the horizontal asymptotes. So here we were going to compare the degrees of the numerator and the denominator. Okay, step number 3 says I'm going to determine the points of discontinuity. Remember, that was what we did in remove the bool. So here we're going to find where the factors in the numerator and the denominator that cancel equals 0, and we're going to plug the value into the simplified function and determine the point. Step number 4 says I'm going to draw the asymptotes with the dotted lines. Y'all make sure you underline dotted lines. Okay, and then step number 5 says I'm going to make a table of important values. And step number 6 says I'm going to plot the points and sketch the graph. So I'm going to work the sample problem for you. And then tomorrow in class, you guys are going to work 1 through 4. Okay, so let's look at the sample problem. Okay, so step number 1, before I can actually answer any of these questions and graph it, I need to factor. So remember, my step number 1, I'm going to factor. Okay, so here, if I factor my numerator, I'm going to have a 3x plus 2, and I'm going to have an x minus 4. And that's all over. Remember, my denominator is called what? That's right, a difference of squares. So I'm going to have an x plus 4, and I'm going to have an x minus 4. So now that I have factored, now we can follow the steps that are above my example. So number 1 says I'm going to locate the vertical asymptote. So for the vertical asymptote, remember what I told y'all yesterday was we set the denominator equal to 0 and we solve. Okay, for step number 3, it says I'm going to find the the RD, which is the removable discontinuity. Okay, so remember, whenever I canceled out, that was my RD. So here, if I look at my factored equation, my x minus 4's cancel. So since my x minus 4's cancel, I set for the RD my x minus 4 equal to 0, and I'm going to solve. So when I add 4 to both sides, my RD becomes x equals 4. So here's your RD. Okay? The next thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to do my vertical asymptote. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and finish the RD first. So if x is my RD, which is x equals 4, I'm going to plug 4 back into the equation to get my y value. So what I have left, I'm going to have 3, which is my numerator, times my answer, which is 4. So I'm going to put it right here, plus 2, because that's what's left in my numerator, because I canceled out the x minus 4's. And what's left in my denominator is x plus 4. So again, the x, which is 4, I'm going to plug in there as well. So when I solve that, I get 3 times 4, which is 12, plus 2 is 14. And then 4 plus 4 is 8. So I have 14 over 8, which when I divide that in a calculator, I get 1.75. So my RD, the coordinate point, is 4, 1.75. So there's my answer for the RD. Okay, so remember, the next one for my VA, we were going to set what was left in the denominator, so that's my x plus 4, equal to 0, and I'm going to solve then. So here I subtract 4, and I get x equals a negative 4. Okay, then I also have to find the horizontal asymptote. Okay, my next step is going to be to find my horizontal asymptote. Now remember, I have to follow the rules. So I'm going to look at my biggest degree in the numerator and the denominator. So again, I have a 2 and a 2. So my exponents are the same. Now my rule tells me if they are the same, that I'm going to use my leading coefficients. Okay, now my leading coefficient in the numerator is a 3. And my leading coefficient in the denominator, even though there's not a number, we know it's 1. So if I have y equals 3 over 1, my HA is just that y equals 3. Okay, so remember, we're looking at the degree of the numerator, and it's the same as the denominator. I'm going to use my leading coefficients. Okay, so my next one says I'm going to draw the asymptotes with the dotted lines. So let's look at our graph. Okay, so the next thing it asks me to do is I'm going to draw the asymptotes with the dotted line, and I'm going to make a table. So let's make a table first. So here, I'm going to enter into my calculator y equals, I have 3x squared minus 10x minus 8, and that's all divisible by my denominator, which is x squared minus 16. So I'm going to go to my table, so I hit second graph, and it asks me to fill out the table from -5 all the way to a +6. So at -5, I have 13. At -4, I have error. So can somebody tell me why I'm going to have an error at -4? That's right, because it was my vertical asymptote. So remember, wherever I see error, that is my vertical asymptote, which is what we found by hand. At -3, I have -7. At 1, I have a +1. If I scroll down, at 2, I have 1.3 or 1 1/3. If I go to 4, I have another error. Now, can somebody tell me why I have an error at a +4? Because it wasn't a vertical asymptote, but what was it? That's right, it's called the point of discontinuity, or our RD. Now, our RD is what's considered a hole. So in a minute when we graph it, you're going to see that there's a physical circle and a hole in my graph. And then my last one is at +6, which is +2. Okay, so let's fill out that table. Okay, now let's talk about the graph. So the first thing it tells me to do is take my dotted lines, and I'm going to draw them where my asymptotes are. So my first asymptote was a vertical at -4. So at -4, I'm going to draw that dotted line right here. Now it's a continuous line, so make sure you put arrows on the end. The next horizontal, or the next asymptote I had was the horizontal, which is at +3. So here's my next asymptote. At +3, I'm going to have a dotted line. Okay, then it tells me I've made the table. Then it says I'm going to plot points and sketch the graph. So I want you to take these points in the table and sketch the graph. So your graph should look something similar to this. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this hole right here. That is where I had an error in my table, and it was my point of discontinuity. Okay, so my point of discontinuity, which was at a +4 and a little bit under the 2, I'm physically going to put a hole in my graph. That's what an RD is. Okay, so like I said, I want you to go ahead and finish the sample problem. Make sure you got everything copied down, and we'll finish 1 through 4 in class tomorrow.